Welcome to the Marc Steiner Show right here on the Real News Network. It's a pleasure to have you all with us. And welcome to the official launch of our show, a double pleasure. Every week, producer Erica Blount and I will be bringing you interviews and stories from the intersection of culture and politics, in-depth conversations with leading activists and artists about the events that affect our lives, and presenting stories we think we won't find anywhere else. So today we begin with Doctors Gerald Horne and Nikki Taylor to explore how American fascistic oppression is really nothing new to Black and Indigenous communities in our country, and what it says as a warning to the rest of America. Then we have a conversation with Cindy Blackman Santana, amazing drummer and musician who is also a deeply spiritual and political thinker. And she brings that to all of our music, as you'll see shortly. So now we open with our conversations with Doctors Gerald Horne and Nikki Taylor. Enjoy. We are starting our in-depth look at what fascism means in America today and what it meant before. There's a prevailing opinion that the United States started making really strong strides toward the conservative right under Richard Nixon. Well, that's true. And that may be the beginning of the move towards fascism. But Malcolm X said, the United States has always been a prison for Black people. If the enslavement of Africans and the genocide against Indigenous people are the foundation of capitalism and imperialism, we have to understand that people of color have been experiencing fascism in the United States for centuries, from the genocide to enslavement, post-Reconstruction terror that gave birth to the Klan, to policing and surveillance in Black and brown worlds, the prison industrial complex, and the world of mass incarceration, its latest form. The difference is that it hasn't been called fascism when it happens to people of color. As the country moves further towards fascism, as people think, as evidenced by the National Guard and Homeland Security storming protesters and Trump refusing to denounce white supremacist groups, could what has happened to people of color for decades, for centuries, be a harbinger of what could happen to all of our futures in the United States? And are we in a battle for our future? I think we are. I'll just leave you with this quote here I thought about the other day as I was reading Langston Hughes. He spoke in Paris at the Second International Writers' Conference in 1937, and his quote was, "Give Franco a hood, and he would be a member of the Ku Klux Klan, a Kliegel. Fascism is what the Ku Klux Klan will be when it combines with the Liberty League and starts using machine guns and airplanes instead of a few yards of rope. In America, Negroes don't have to be told what fascism is. In action, we know." So let me welcome our guests. Once again, Dr. Gerald Horne, who needs no introduction here at the Real News. He's joined us so many times in the past. And with his analysis, his wisdom, his thoughts, he holds the John J. and Rebecca Morse Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. His latest book is The Dawning of the Apocalypse: The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. And Dr. Nikki Taylor, professor and chair of the History Department at Howard University. Her latest book is Driven Towards Madness: The Fugitive Slave Margaret Garner and the Tragedy on the Ohio. And welcome to both of you. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And Nikki Taylor, welcome to the Real News for the first time. It's great to have you here with us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So let me begin with you, Gerald Horne. The book you wrote, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave and Resistance and the Origin of the United States, you posit in there that the Revolutionary War was really a movement that was fought to preserve the right to enslave others. Let's talk about that and all the contradictions from the beginning and the resistance movement of Black people and others and the masses. We can learn from that time, but that's a part of our history and a way of looking at our past that is not universally known nor popular.
Well, I think you need to realize that when this so-called republic was given birth in 1776, in many ways, it represented the organizing of an apartheid state. That is to say that it's not coincidental or accidental that the rights accorded through the subsequent U.S. Constitution were not accorded to the entire population. To cite one example amongst many, the vaunted Second Amendment of the United States, which has been interpreted to suggest that folks have the right to bear arms, certainly that right did not belong to the enslaved African population. If it had, the institution of slavery would have been abolished well before 1865.
Yep.
And the strategic ambition of the settler class was to keep arms out of the hands of Native Americans. And so I think that if you fast forward today, what's happening is that as a result of changed international conditions and unremitting struggle, by those who were initially excluded from the alleged bounty of the foundation of the Republic, these excluded forces have now been able to garner a modicum of rights. And what's happening is that the counter-revolutionary impulse, which helped to give birth to the United States in the first instance, is now asserting itself in a muscular fashion. In some ways, what it reminds me of is the system of lynching, which followed the abolition of slavery post-1865. That is to say that those who were non-Black, who expressed any sympathy towards the victim of lynching, oftentimes were persecuted or lynched themselves. It seems inevitable that once you have a retreat of Jim Crow and a passel of rights being accorded, for example, to the Black population, that it would eventually devolve into a system whereby the counter-revolutionary impulse would then seek to impose that persecution, that form of lynching upon non-Black folk. And in some ways, that's a pithy summary of what fascism may portend. That is to say that those who thought they had been excluded from the sharp talons and sharp claws of fascism will actually be included and be subjected to that kind of persecution. And unless we're careful, that is what is in store.
That's interesting. I'm going to come back to that last thought of yours. And Dr. Taylor, it's Nikki Taylor, it was good to have you with us here in the Real News, as I said. And your first book, it was Frontiers of Freedom. And it's interesting because you talk about the Black community in Cincinnati, where there was a real fight back and people battled for freedom, and it included Black nationalism, armed defense. So talk about this and other similar African-American communities that kind of serve in some ways as a template for resistance and what that says to us today.
Definitely. I think all of my books grapple with the question of Black freedom, Black citizenship, and resistance. So that book was the beginning of my intellectual journey. So I think that community, what a lot of people don't realize is that the racial violence among free Black people in northern cities such as New York and Philadelphia and Cincinnati was as American as apple pie. So when Black communities would form in these cities, free Black communities, many of them had been legitimately free since the American Revolution. Oftentimes whites, moved on and egged on by the media, would decide that they wanted to cleanse the community. And there's one such a case in 1829 in Cincinnati, which is what historians would think is the first incidents of ethnic cleansing against the Black population in America. And whites in the city of Cincinnati determined that they wanted to rid themselves of all of the Black community. But rather than be helpless and victimized, the Black community quickly converted their efforts and turned it into a Black nationalist or Black immigrationist effort. And so they tried to figure out where they would go. First, they tried Haiti. And then they were considering a rural community in Ohio. And then they settled on Upper Canada because they believed that there they could have some rights and some level of citizenship. And so they decided to move there. And so we have the first Black colony in Canada planted in 1829, an outgrowth of that. In addition to that, in 1841, I think is what you're referring to, there was an all-out race war against the Black community there. And rather, again, sit and be victimized, the Black community decided to pick up guns and decided to fight back against their fellow citizens in Ohio. And so they organized themselves, and it actually was a race war. And it only was stopped, the Black effort was only stopped by the intervention of the state apparatus. So when the state brought out its militia and cannons and decided to disarm the Black community, there ended that effort of radical self-defense. And such a thing back then was unheard of for Black men to take up guns in a free city in the North and shoot white people. It was unheard of. And so that's really part of the richer legacy. And Black nationalism, which many people believe started with either Marcus Garvey or even Malcolm X in the 20th century, there are elements of Black nationalism dating back to Dr. Horne's American Revolution era. So Black nationalism back then was about finding an all-Black colony or a space where we could live free of white domination. So those are just a few examples of how African Americans across time have tried to battle and fight against what Pierre Vandenberg calls a Herrenvolk democracy, or a whites-only democracy.
So, I mean, I kind of where that leaves us now. I mean, one of the things that I've had a number of conversations about this with a lot of people recently, and about what we're facing in this country right now, and that looking at Black and Indigenous history in this country and reality right now in the 21st century. And you know, I was thinking about I was reading this piece this morning, and Oya Baraka talked about Du Bois's work, and he argued that the end of Reconstruction heaved Afro-America into fascism. There's no other term for it. The overthrow of democratically elected government and the rule of direct terror by the most reactionary sector of finance capital, carried out with murder, intimidation, robbery by the first stormtroopers against the Hitlerian prototype, the Ku Klux Klan, directly financed by Northern capital. So I just praise that because in some ways it's analogous to a moment we're facing now. And, you know, for the first time you see literally millions and millions of non-African American people in the streets saying no, and begin to open their minds around racism and the depth of racism in America. So where do you think this takes us at this moment? I mean, it's not the Black world's job to teach the rest of America about fascism, but the reality is we are facing it. So what do you think this particular moment says about our past and where it's taking us at this moment? Gerald, do you want to begin, and then Nikki Taylor jump in?
Well, it's too soon to say where things are headed, but certainly there are some pessimistic signs. Indeed, it is possible to say already that it's unsustainable, as the post-Civil War period showed, to have a kind of fascism visited upon Indigenous peoples and Black peoples, and a kind of democracy for the rest. Inevitably, that's an unsustainable system, and fortunately, a changing international situation, referencing the rise of a socialist camp, national liberation movements in Africa and the Caribbean, forced the United States to rethink and reconsider its atrocious and hateful and spiteful Jim Crow system. And therefore, you have the agonizing retreat from the more egregious elements of Jim Crow beginning in the 1950s and accelerating in the 1960s. But now, with the changed international situation, with the implosion of the socialist camp post-1989, and with what was thought to be the rise of an unchallenged superpower in Washington, you have a lessening of pressure on US imperialism, and inevitably it's led to these fascist type trends. We'll know in a few days where this will take us. At least I think we'll have a better idea. But already there are some very concerning signs. I'm thinking of the Oath Keepers, for example, one of these numerous paramilitary forces that has recruited heavily in US police departments and the US military, not unlike its counterparts across the Atlantic in Germany, which led to the disbanding of a number of German security forces because of their penetration by neo-Nazi elements, not unlike the Oath Keepers. And likewise, if you look at the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters and the Boogaloo Boys and the Proud Boys, they recruit heavily amongst military veterans, those who were taught that in Afghanistan and Iraq, you try to resolve political questions through the barrel of a gun. And inevitably, those chickens have come home to roost, and they have adopted this idea that the way you resolve political questions in the United States is likewise through the barrel of a gun. You may have noticed what's going on in the state of Virginia, which the right wing feels is slipping from its grasp. And as a result, you have the rise of various militia movements, which are seeking the legal imprimatur of counties in Virginia that are dominated by the right wing. I'm sure you noticed what happened in the state of Michigan, where the so-called militia forces, the paramilitary forces, hatched a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, and put her on trial, presumably execute her after a sham trial. When the 45th US president, the Manhattan Mussolini, comes to Michigan, he eggs on crowds who chant very dangerous and imperiling slogans against the governor of Michigan. It's not beyond the pale of imagination to suspect that if the election does not go the way that the oath in the Oval Office thinks it should go, that there could be a heightening of these kinds of tensions with the US Supreme Court and the federal judiciary now under the thumb of the right wing, putting its legal stamp of approval on what could very well turn out to be an ultra-righteous coup that portends ill for many of us.
I mean, that scenario is frightening, and the problem is that it's ultra realistic. I was thinking what Gerald was saying, Nikki Taylor, and the other day we talked with Daniel Suggestion, who is a retired major who fought in Afghanistan, graduated from West Point, taught at West Point, and what he said, yeah, the military may be over 40% people of color at this point, but the combat units, the units doing the fighting, the units doing all the work on that ground, are overwhelmingly white and from southern and mountain states. He was a major in those units. So, I mean, we are facing a future we can't quite figure out what this interregnum is going to bring us and what could happen. So I wonder, let me just think about what you were saying earlier. And I was also thinking about it in terms of, in the 1960s, you know, there was this, there was the original Rainbow Coalition that took place between the Appalachian whites, the Young Patriots, the Brown Berets, and the Young Lords, Mexican and Puerto Ricans, and the Black Panthers in Chicago, and which got Fred Hampton murdered. And the idea of building interracial coalitions together and the millions of people saying no is always been fraught with either people running away from it or having it disbanded and people being sucked into other things or actually being oppressed. So let's talk about the past and what the past tells us about what we need to do about the future, where this might be taking us.
Yeah, well, as a historian of 19th century history, it's very frightening to see the political culture of today. And when you think about the 19th century, these moments of Black political power and even economic success are always followed by a very violent gut instinct reaction to that. So the failure of Reconstruction happened on the heels of all of these Black senators and congressmen and other people coming to power. So I think in terms of the prospects for today, we have to be very knowledgeable about history to understand where this might go today. And so as Dr. Horne said, it's very frightening to see that our president is invoking some of these paramilitary groups that are possibly going to be, positioned at the polling places. And it's very similar to what happened in the 19th century at the failure of Reconstruction. But in terms of your other question about the possibilities for interracial coalitions, I guess, those possibilities were there in the 60s. And I think what happened is the state was very threatened by that. And so you could look at the FBI files, the COINTELPRO files. It wasn't just the, quote, Black extremists that they were trying to repress and disband and exterminate and frame and turn into political prisoners. It was also members of the Chicano movement and other indigenous groups and things like that. So those things, it's state intervention to basically repress these movements, which is really concerning. I teach a course at Howard now called African Americans and State-Sponsored Injustice. And one of the things we're looking at currently is the parallels between what happened to the Black Panthers and all of those groups in the 60s and early 70s, and what's now happening in terms of surveillance and the mysterious deaths of a lot of the Black Lives Matter activists. And so I'm showing them some of the records from the DC government where they're surveilling the Black Lives Matter activists in the city of DC and our nation's capital. So these things are bound to repeat themselves, especially for a demographic that doesn't have a sound grasp of American history and the possibilities of just ignoring the past could bring for us today.
So, people look at, some people talk these days and write about that we are in a period that could be a third Reconstruction or a precipice that could go either way. If the second Reconstruction was the civil rights movement and the opening of the 50s and 60s and then the repression that pushed backwards, that's reaching its high point at this moment. Could we be at this moment on that precipice of a third Reconstruction, or its opposite, another wave of absolute right-wing terror that dominates the country? I mean, people, when I say this, people look at me and go, "You're making too much of this. This can't be all this." But I don't think I am making too much of this. I think we are at a point where it could go either way, either a third Reconstruction or something much worse. I mean, how do you all see it? Go ahead, Nikki. Why don't you start, and then we'll let Gerald finish up.
Yeah, I definitely think this moment is a watershed moment. In my lifetime, I haven't seen any possibilities of anything like it. And so, yeah, I think it could go either way. And it's not all, I'm not a political determinist. Not everything is determined by the political environment, but necessarily the social relations and the quote racial relations and interethnic relations are at an all-time low in my lifetime. And so that's what's very frightening and scary. And I don't think it'll be resolved on November 3rd. I think this is something like a very ugly can of worms that was opened. And it's going to be hard to rein in our worst impulses. When I say our, I mean Americans' worst impulses, which are division, xenophobia, sexism, all of those things. There's this, a turning back of the clock in a lot of different areas of our society.
Part of the problem when you try to answer that question of which direction are we heading is the fact that the various class forces are fundamentally split. What I mean is that if you look at the craft unions, for example, many of them actually are pro-Trump. The police unions, many of them are actually pro-Trump, pro-right wing in particular. If you look at the officer corps of the US military, many of them are pro-Trump, for example. If you look at the building trades, they're oftentimes split. And if you look at the government workers, American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, Service Employees International Union, they're basically anti-Trump and anti-right wing, but of course, they're disproportionately comprised of Black and brown workers. If you look at the ruling class as well, they're split as well. If you look at the ruling class headquartered in the state from which I am now speaking of Texas, if you look at the folks in the energy industrial complex, Harold Hamm, for example, a billionaire who is one of Mr. Trump's major supporters. If you look at the executives at ExxonMobil, for example, they're all in with regard to a Republican Party victory, because as they see it, with the push towards clean energy and renewables, wind and solar, they can continue extracting fossil fuels from the earth and continue contributing to a crisis in the climate for their narrow financial and economic interests. But at the same time, you have anti-Trump forces in the US ruling class, the much demonized George Soros and some of his comrades in finance capital, who are not as heavily dependent on labor, for example. Or if you look at the Hollywood elite, Jeffrey Katzenberg, the former chief executive at Disney, who raises gobs of money for anti-Trump forces. So the classes are basically split, which makes it very difficult to answer your question definitively as to where we go from here. And in fact, it helps to explain why you're able to pose that question. But certainly, if you look at the international situation, it's become ever more gloomy for US imperialism, not only with regard to the rise of China, but the kind of competition that's now coming from the European Union, principally Germany, which Mr. Trump sees as one of his major foes. That is helping to remove the possibility of US imperialism continuing to grow what they consider to be the low-hanging fruit in the developing countries because of the ever stiffer competition. What that may portend is that putting more pressure on domestic forces because of lesser opportunities for exploitation and plunder internationally. That, of course, would point towards a nightmare scenario of a growth of the right wing and the kind of neo-fascism that your question is pointing towards.
Well, I mean, we can conclude with this. I mean, I think that what you said is pretty profound here. I mean, if you take the nature of capitalism, how it began, and the underpinnings of the development of racist theory and racism that embeds the consciousness of humankind at this point because of what was built here on this planet. And if your analysis is correct, and I'm not saying it's not, I think it is correct, but if the analysis is correct, then it really is an uncertain future. That what we call fascism in today's nomenclature, this neo-fascism, is at our doorstep. And I think we'd be foolish to say it's not. And to me, when I saw some articles that were in a military journal from two former colonels, it's almost like the establishment is a bellwether for what's happening. I mean, the canaries in the coal mine in terms of what's happening. And so I'm curious, when you look at history, when both of you look at history, what does it say to us about what we have to think about in terms of what has to be built to confront and stop it?
Well, certainly the level of organization has to be stepped up, not only with regard to working class organizations, which I've just made reference to, but I would make a particular plea to the Black community, because our saving grace historically has been our ability to organize internationally. I think of the many tours of London and of the British Isles made by Frederick Douglass beginning in the 1840s, when London was considered to be a top antagonist of a growing US imperialism, for example. I think of Ida B. Wells and her tours of London in the 1890s and her campaign against lynching. I think of Paul Robeson in the early 1950s with regard to the We Charge Genocide petition, taking our plight to the then recently born United Nations, seeking to put the leaders of US imperialism in the dock. One of the reasons why Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, and the agonized retreat from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow came when it did, was precisely to clip the wings of those like Robeson and the Civil Rights Congress and left-wing forces. Many of our mainstream organizations accepted that bargain, that is to say, throwing Robeson and his comrades overboard for these civil rights concessions. But now, what helped to drive that compromise, that is to say, a rising national liberation movement, a rising socialist count, is no longer with us. And so US imperialism says that bargain of civil rights concessions, note the conditions that mandated it no longer obtain. And so therefore, we're now forced into a corner. The way to fight our way out of that corner is to go back and revisit the lessons of history, organize internationally, starting perhaps with the United Nations based in New York, or the Organization of American States based in Washington, D.C., reaching out to our friends 90 miles from Florida in socialist Cuba, going further south into Venezuela. I think that it's apparent and evident what we need to do. The question is, do our organizations and leadership have the consciousness or the courage to pursue a path that can rescue us all?
Dr. Nikki Taylor.
I wanted to ask Dr. Horne if he thinks the international community is as sensitive to the hypocrisy of American democracy as it was when Ida B. Wells and Robeson and some of these other activists were using the international sphere for that means. I'm not all that confident that, that the rest of the world is as vested in the plight of Black America currently. I don't think we will have the same level of sympathy as we used to have at this current moment.
Well, that's possible, but I don't think we'll know until we try. And certainly, I think that it's not necessarily whether or not they're interested in the plight of Black America. The question is, do they see a mutual interest with Black America in weakening the ultra-right, which not only threatens our interests, but threatens their interests too? That is to say that what drove Moscow and Washington together between 1941 and 1945 was not necessarily that they were on the same page, but they felt they had a mutual antagonist in fascist Germany. So I think the question is, do our friends in the international community see an interest in weakening the ultra-right forces in Washington and on Wall Street? And I think many of them do.
So, okay, you were going to say something, Nikki. I'll stop. I'll wait.
Oh, I just looking at history, we've, tried a lot of these different strategies. We've tried moral suasion. We've tried economic boycotting, Black nationalism. And, I think at this moment, I'm not really sure what the solution is, other than organizing and raising the critical consciousness of not just Black people here in this part of the world, but also white Americans, other people of color. But as far as the path to liberation or to wrest us free of the grips of this American fascism, it's not. I don't feel as hopeful in the solutions, just because I do have all of this history in my head.
So as we conclude here, let's bring it back home then for a moment, because I think what both of you are saying, I mean, are right in terms of what the international world is, but also if you look at the United States for a moment, let's end with talking about where we are internally and what the possibilities are we have here. I was thinking about how in the civil rights movement, that there was in the early days of the civil rights movement, with the international, the interracial movement going south with SNCC and CORE and the rest. I was thinking about this the other day and running about this the other day. That 70% of the freedom riders who were white were Jewish, and that's because we came from a generation that was just right after the Holocaust and related completely to what the Black world was going through because of what our stories of our parents and grandparents were. So, and that was reality. And now you, and I wonder now in this century, when we're seeing these masses of people in the streets, when we're seeing a vast majority of people saying no to Trump, even though that doesn't mean he wouldn't win because of the electoral college that came out of the history of enslavement in America. What does this say about our organizing here? What do you think happens here? What do you see happening here that actually confront that future from our end? And is it multiracial, or is that a myth and too hard to come by?
Well, I think if you look at what's going on in the streets from New York through Kenosha to Portland, you'll get a glimpse of the kind of multiracial coalition that makes some of us a bit more optimistic about the future. That is to say, if you look at who was gunned down in the streets in Kenosha, for example, in that particular instance, these were not Black people who were killed protesting what happened to the severely wounded Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Likewise, I'm heartened by the kinds of slogans that are being raised. For example, in Portland, Oregon, which has seen a spate of unprecedented, unparalleled protests since May 25th, 2020, when George Floyd was lynched on camera in Minneapolis. What's interesting is that many of the forces are raising the slogan of stolen people on stolen land. That is to say, the stolen people being the Black people who were victimized by the transatlantic slave trade and the indigenous populations who had their land taken. In other words, they're going to the essence of settler colonialism. And unlike previous generations of the left, and I take my hat off to them, at least figuratively, but of course, they were raising the Woody Guthrie hymn of "This land is your land, this land is my land," and in some ways eviscerating, if not liquidating, the question of Native Americans. That is to say, this land is and was their land and was taken through settler colonialism. We had an ideological advance, at least if you take Portland as a portent of what's to come, by raising this question of the very nature and essence of the state and this so-called republic. And it's quite appropriate that this takes place in Portland, since when it came into the Union in the 1850s, the naive historians say that it was on the anti-slavery basis, but actually it was on the basis of no Black people allowed, be they slave or be they free. And it's that kind of historical misunderstanding that's led to a certain naivete with regard to the potentiality of progress and progressivism in the United States. So I'm heartened by the fact that our peers and comrades in Portland are really cutting to the essence of what this country is all about. And that gives me hope and optimism for the future.
And Nikki Taylor?
Yeah, I guess for me, if there's some hope to be that I have in this moment is, number one, it does seem to be interracial, fully interracial, this movement. And not only interracial and interethnic, but their class dimensions. I mean, they're all classes, socioeconomic classes are represented. And that gives me a little bit of hope in this current movement. In addition, the critique that's coming out of this current movement seems to be a critique against the state. and the state's complicity in these actions. And so I think that's different, and it lends itself well to action against the state, and not necessarily action against white Americans or action against wealthy Americans, but the state's role in this level of fascism. And so that will allow for more unity, I think, across different classes and regions, because we see a common source of our oppression, and that's the state apparatus.
But, Dr. Nikki Taylor, Dr. Gerald Horne, there's been a fascinating discussion. I really, really love the engagement between the two of you and joining us here. This has been great and very thorough. We look forward to many more conversations like this. I really want to thank you for taking the time to join us here today. It's been a pleasure to have you both.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
A real pleasure. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And now we're going to bring you a conversation with musician and drummer Cindy Blackman Santana, as we take a deep dive into music, her music, and the world of music, and the Black and Latino worlds in all of its political and spiritual depths.
Social justice, y'all. Get it, Andy.
Let's stop the madness. This is social justice. Stand for the righteous. For social justice.
What you're hearing under me right now, is singer-songwriter and virtuoso drummer Cindy Blackman Santana, who has worked for drummer Lenny Kravitz and with her husband Carlos Santana, and many, many others, and her own quartet, including Pharoah Sanders. She just released a new album that you're hearing, Give the Drummer Some, and that's what it does. The drummer takes the lead on vocals, beat, and direction. The album bends genres: pop, jazz, rock, metal, hip-hop, and funk. And today, we sit down with Cindy Blackman Santana to explore this new album and her inspiration for it. Now, here at the Marc Steiner Show, we explore the intersection of culture and politics. And Cindy Blackman Santana and her husband, Carlos Santana, as well as guests on this album, like Living Colour's Vernon Reid and Metallica's Kirk Hammett, have been vocal politically for years. And facing the times we're in now, artists give us not just a soundtrack, but a unique point of view to provide context, insight, spirituality with their lyrics through their work. And they speak to us at times, and they do very strongly on this album. So welcome, Cindy Blackman Santana. Good to have you with us here on the Marc Steiner Show and the Real News Network.
Thank you.
So let's start, Cindy, with the first cut, Imagine. Mm-hmm. And Yoko Ono gave you a thumbs up for doing this, which is no easy trick to get. But you got it. And your husband, Santana, is doing this incredible solo. Mm-hmm. So talk a bit about this track and what inspired you to want to do this. I'm thinking, especially the way you opened it. You opened it like the Einstein's quote, "Imagination is more important than knowledge," which is one of my favorite quotes, that whole little riff you went through. And I actually like the whole thing you said. You said, "For knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution." So talk about that and why that began it, what all that meant.
Well, that was Carlos's idea to add that in front. And when he said it, I was like, wow, that's brilliant. I love it. And it was just perfect because it sets the mood and not only for the song, but it sets the mood for the whole record. And it also sets the mood for the message that we wanted to present to people in doing this song. So I felt that, like him, I felt that it was a perfect intro, to use that. And we've vacillated with a couple of songs as the opener for the record, but we always came back to Imagine. And Carlos and I like to take rides in the car, and we both make up separate playlists, and then we play each other's playlists, and we see what might need to be moved here, what flows better there. So it's like a little fun thing that we do. But it's funny because invariably we always came back to, Imagine as the opener. And so with the addition of that Einstein quote, it was just, hands down, it had to be that opening. And the message of this song is so poignant and so very relevant today. It's sadly relevant on one hand, because it's too bad that we still have to talk about certain things. It's still too bad that we have certain issues in society that have not been cleared as of yet. It's too bad that we have to, give messages like this. But it's also a fortunate thing for us that we have songs like this that are so strong, and that the messages are so beautiful and so poignant that we can share.
When you first started drumming with Carlos Santana in that tour, and there was this, and what you're describing here is something that's almost like this spiritual political connection that happened between the two of you, and the riff you just went through is that.
Yes, absolutely. When we first met, well, we were kind of briefly introduced at one point when we were both playing on a festival together. I was playing with Lenny Kravitz, and of course he was with his band Santana. And I just met him in passing, no, I didn't even talk to him, And in 2010, he needed a sub for a drummer, and then he called me to do that. And of course, I wanted to play with that band, so I said yes. It was just a one gig thing. But we started talking and really connecting, and there was something that was lacking in my life at that point, which was having a partner who was on a spiritual path that was parallel to mine in terms of the quest to the desire. Not that it had to be exactly like mine, but in terms of the intention, and the intent and the importance in that individual's life. And so I hadn't had a guy like that in my life in quite a while. So, when we started talking, it was like, whoa, I really like where this is going. And then on top of that, he loved Miles Davis, and he invited me to listen to some Miles Davis and some Tony Williams. And there you got me, you got the spiritual and you got Miles and Tony. Okay.
When I was listening to the album, the first time I texted Erica Blount, who I worked with on this program and produced it with me, and I said, Erica, this sounds like Miles. And then I said, oh wait, that's what the name of the cut is. It's Miles Away.
Yeah, he's probably my all-time favorite musician. Apart from my drummers, he's my favorite. I love Miles. Love what he did on the instrument, what he did in the music over the decades, and what he was a catalyst for, and what he allowed to happen in his band, which was, that he trusted the musicians enough, and he chose genius musicians. So, he trusted them enough to just say, okay, go, what do you got? What's a little direction here and there, but he was like one of very few people, if many, who have changed the course of music as many times as he did. Tony Williams would be another one, and there aren't many more, that have changed the course of music that much. Like 7 times Miles changed the course of music, I believe. So it's like,
yep, really,
really just amazing. And so he's one of my all-time favorites. I love jazz. That's my thing. I got turned on to the complexities of jazz in terms of drumming when I was 13. We had a family friend who was a drummer who played, his name was Doug Woods, and he changed his name to Daoud. He played with Jackie McLean. He was a good buddy of Jackie's, and they did a lot of playing together. He was a family friend of ours, and he wrote out on a piece of paper, which I still have somewhere in my archives, and this was from when I was 13. He drew a picture of a plant on one side, and a great drawing. He drew a beautiful plant on one side, and on the other side, he wrote out this passage from Max Roach that he was playing with a ride pattern, shaking it, and triplets in the left hand, and bass drum feathering on all fours, and 2 and 4 on the sock cymbal. And at 13, I was like, oh, really? They do that with all 4 limbs? Because I had just been hearing drummers that played like a 3-limb style, all the funk drummers, the rock drummers, the pop drummers. But from then on, I was hooked because, you know, it was very intriguing to me that it had so many complexities and so many textures, you know, and gave you so many choices. Because with using a four limb style, you can use four limbs, or you can use three, or you can use two, or you can use one, but you have all the choices, you know. And so I was really drawn to that. So jazz is definitely, you know, at my core. That's my root. I can't change that. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't, and I don't want to, but I couldn't, you know, because that's.
So why would you?
I wouldn't. It's who I am, you know.
Right. Now you can feel it, and you can feel it from the music. And when I've seen your interviews, you can feel it there too. I mean, so yeah, it's there.
I'm happy about that because I want people to not only love what I love, but I want them to know this music because it's so creatively inspiring for a person to use this noggin, you know, this brain. My dad used to say, it ain't just a hat rack, which means use the intellect you got, you know, think, you got a brain, use it. And so, you know, in jazz, you know, you're really stretching the boundaries of that because you have, like I was saying, so many complexities of harmony, rhythm, melody, interplay, you know, concept, technique, you know, it's all there for us to explore. So I want more people to know about that because, you know, the more free thinkers we have, the more creative thinkers we have, the more sparks of creativity, energy, and light that we have, the more productive, the more powerful, the more beautiful, the more peaceful, the more godlike our society will be, because God is the supreme creator, you know. And I'm not a fanatic, but to me, that's the truth. So, you know, I want to share that with people because it's infectious, and I want people to catch that affection, not infection. Catch that affection. We don't need infections. We see what that is. Catch that affection.
When you cut this album, we're now in the midst of all these struggles, from George Floyd to fires burning to people taking racism more seriously than they ever have before, millions of people in the street. And you have Mother Earth, you have social justice, and that rap by Andy Vargas.
Yes.
And his Stop the Madness, it's social justice. Stop the madness, it's social justice.
Yes.
Stop the madness. This is social justice. Stand for the righteous. For social justice.
So when did you cut this? And well, because it fits this moment.
Well, we did this way before COVID, so it's just, you know, for us, it's like really enlightening to see that, you know, it just fits into a niche where it's really needed right now. You know, we need messages like that. But it was definitely done before COVID. The only thing that we did during COVID was just finish the logistics of the liner notes because the artwork was already done, the music was already done, and then we recorded some videos, you know, in COVID. But everything else was finished. So, you know, this was like for social justice. I had some ideas that I wrote down and I gave to Andy, and I said, this is the subject matter, and this is what I want to convey. And Andy just started writing stuff, you know, and he came back with this rap that was just off the hook, you know. It was so off the hook that initially I was, you know, I really am an advocate for children, you know, everything about children, education of children, helping abused and child trafficked children, finding ways to inspire children. And so I wanted to call it Save the Babies, you know, which we used in there, you know, a little bit. We used that phrase, but Andy came up with the actual title Social Justice through the stuff that he was rapping, you know. So he's just really brilliant because he just took the core of what I wanted to say, and then he just really expounded, you know, and just came up with this stuff that's just incredible. So it really fits right in. So everybody, to me, everybody on this record was really keyed in and in tune, you know, whether we knew it or not. We were in tune with some messages and some feelings and some energy that are very timely for this moment.
In this time we're living in, the music is part of the resistance. It's part of giving people a visceral intellectual feel for what we're facing. You know, I was thinking that all through social justice and how that combines that political and spiritual element. But it is, even though Baha'i may not be political, we're in this political moment, and your work speaks to that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That means a lot, because that means that the message is translating, you know, and that's the point. The point is for the message to translate. The point is for the message to inspire. The point is for the message to really be a catalyst for individual thinking and individual growth, but also for the unity of everyone to understand, you know, that we're all wrapped in something different, you know, whether we have, you know, blonde hair, blue eyes, you know, brown hair, red hair, brown eyes, white skin, yellow skin, caramel skin, brown skin, blue black skin, whatever it is, we need to understand that there's one human race with race variance. You know, there is one species called a flower, but flowers have many variants, and that's the same as the human race. You know, there's one race, but different variants, you know. So we have hues, H-U-E, we have hues, you know, in this humanity. And it'll be a great day when everybody recognizes that as beautiful, because I think it is beautiful.
I agree completely. I mean, we create those things that divide us.
Yeah.
And no, we don't, but society has created those things that divide us.
Oh, we
and
as a whole.
I think about this, yeah. And I think to finish up, I mean, you always think about that in terms of how you use your love of art, the spirituality, the politics. I've heard you talk about Van Gogh and the textures,
yeah,
and the connection between art and music, and how it's endless. And I think that's one of the things I think that music does for us sometimes, is to bring those connections together, to make us see there's a different way to live. You don't have to preach it and beat it. You feel it, move it, and that's what I think you're trying to do. That's at least that's my perspective. I'm not trying to say what you do, but that's how it feels you're trying to do.
Well, I appreciate that. Actually, you're right, because you know, music is, you know, it's interminable in its effect that it can have on people, and it's, you know, it's the one thing that translates every barrier and blockage that we put up, you know, whether it's language, whether it's the guise of religion, whether it's the guise of culture, or, you know, whatever it is that we make up in our heads, music transcends all of that. You know, you can have a song that a person who is completely liberal is listening to, you know, somebody who just loves everyone, you know, who has, you know, no prejudices, no nothing. Then you can let a person who is a complete racist against anybody who's different from them, no matter what the difference is, they can listen to the same song and like the same song. So how is that? You know, it's because music touches on so many other levels that are much deeper than just the surface of you hearing this song, especially if your heart is open, especially, you know, if you are true to your own vibration and to the vibration of whatever the music is sending out, you know, if you're not blocking that. So music is a beautiful thing, and I'm really proud to have been given the gift of exploring that, and the gift of being able to hone in and try to develop it more and more, and the gift of being able to share that with other people.
I want to come back to the world we're in right now, and we covered that a lot together on our program. And I mean, to me, I feel like we're on a precipice. And when you see the 23 million people went to the streets after George Floyd who was murdered, and you see that, and you see the responses we're getting, and the kind of, for want of a better term, white racist kind of thugs in the streets combating everybody. And we're at a very difficult time. And I listened to your album at least 3 times in a row after Erica sent it to me. And and it does speak to me to that. And I sent it out to my daughters and said, listen to this album. I mean, I know you're hip hop queens, but listen to this album. They do have a daughter taking that. They'll beat me up for saying that. I mean, but it's, could you speak to where we are now and how it touches you and what you want to say about that?
We can really take a look at what all of our previous actions as a society have done in terms of bringing us to this point. You know, why are we at the point that we're at? You know, we have to ask ourselves why. You know, we have to ask ourselves, how did we get here? What could we have done to not be in this place, but to be, you know, in a more peaceful place? And what can we do now to fix that? We have to understand that there's still a lot of hatred. And then we have to understand what the energy of hatred does, to understand why we need to eradicate that. Because what does hatred do? Hatred decays not only society, but it decays brains, it decays bodies. You know, it's like pouring acid on something. You know, that's what hatred is. It's like taking a big vat of acid and just, you know, it's just going to destroy everything. You know, so this period to me, this kind of great pause, and I only call it great pause, not because of the loss of life or because of, you know, any of the tragedies or fatalities that we've had, but I call it a great pause because in this moment of, you know, everything having stopped for a minute, gives us a chance to rewire this, to reset this, and to rewire this, and to reset this, to rewire these, and to reset these, you know. But we don't always use that to our advantage in a positive way, you know. But if we understand that that's a gift that we're given, the power of reason and choice, and if we understand that the more choices that we make that are helpful, loving, and kind, the better we're going to make every planet and every person on the planet, and the better we're going to make this entire planet, this entire realm, this entire world. You know, if you think of, for instance, when I'm playing brushes, you know what I used to say to myself, especially when I was first learning how to play brushes, and even now, I think of playing certain things on the brushes so delicately that I could play that on a baby's belly and it wouldn't hurt it. You know, I think of doing things in such a gentle way that my grandmother, my grandmothers are transitioned already, but you know, that my grandmother, you know, the sweetest woman in the world, my other grandmother, the sweetest woman in the world, my mother, sweetest woman in the world, that I could see myself just rubbing their cheeks and doing something so sweet to them that it would make them smile. So if we can treat everybody with that kind of reverence and that kind of respect, then we're going to start to see some changes. And so each individual can really look at themselves in the eye and discern and determine and ascertain, you know, what it is that they need to do to make changes that will help this flow become much sweeter. And that's a responsibility, but it's a responsibility that we all need to take.
Well, Cindy Blackman Santana, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate your mind, your music, and what you bring to us. Thank you.
Thank you too. This has been a beautiful interview. I really appreciate it, and hope to talk to you again.
Thank you for joining us today. So for producer Erica Blount and editor Sepa Batuscan, I'm Marc Steiner for the Marc Steiner Show right here on the Real News Network. Thanks for joining us and take care.